Welcome back, everyone, to part 3 of our look at the fascinating story of Grigori Rasputin. If you didn't see the first 2 episodes of this reaction series, there's a link in the description that will take you back to episode 1. As always, there's also a link to the original content over at Extra History. I was listening yesterday to the part of one of my favorite podcasts, which is Dan Carlin's podcast on World War I, and he does a whole section in one of those episodes about Rasputin, and he really takes a fascinating look at some of the stuff that we're talking about. I highly recommend it if you're into podcasts at all. I think it's called Countdown to Armageddon, something like that. It's really, really good stuff, so I definitely check that out if you're into this time period, and especially World War I. Let's go ahead and dive into episode 3.
Rasputin came to the island at Hermogenes' invitation. He expected to pray and perhaps eat dinner. Not this. Hermogenes, holding an icon, implores Rasputin to repent his wickedness. Then Iliodor hits him with a large cross.
The power of Christ compels you. I don't know. I feel like hitting somebody over the head with a cross is not the ideal way to get them to repent of their sins. But interesting that he's kind of getting ambushed with this. I'll be curious to see how he responds.
Declares that he is a sinner, guilty of lust. He admits he visited sex workers and slept with his followers. They call him a false prophet and make him swear to never go near the royal family again. And according to one account, he agreed. But if he did, it was another sin because it was a lie. Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping us tell today's historic tale. When Hermogenes confronted Rasputin in December of 1911, it signaled a major turning point in his reputation. We don't know exactly what happened, and many accounts of these events disagree. In fact, Iliodor may have not even been there, but regardless, the fallout would be extreme. While Rasputin had been in the Holy Land, Iliodor had written him asking for his help after his conspiracy-laden screeds against the Prime Minister had led to police involvement. But when a response didn't come fast enough for him, he took Rasputin's silence as a betrayal and turned on him. Soon, he and Hermogenes were central figures in a public campaign to banish Rasputin from court. Iliodor in particular pushed the narrative that Rasputin controlled the royal family and was Alexandra's lover.
When you're having bad press of your own, nothing is better than refocusing on someone who's even worse. So, yeah, maybe I've had some trouble, maybe I've gone down the wrong path, maybe I've made some bad choices, but at least I'm not Rasputin. And he turns the focus on him. And that's been a common strategy throughout history to refocus people's attention. You know, if you're having trouble at home, it's called the wag the dog scenario. There was a movie that came out a number of years ago called Wag the Dog, where I never saw it, but I think it had something to do with a president trying to take the focus off of a scandal by starting a war. And a lot of people accused Bill Clinton of this in the late 1990s when he was dealing with the Monica Lewinsky scandal of launching cruise missiles on enemy targets to try and take the focus off what was happening at home.
But then, odd things started happening, particularly bad things for Rasputin's enemies. Theophan was exiled, Hermogenes banished to a remote monastery, and Iliodor essentially arrested and imprisoned before renouncing his faith and going on the run. Now, there is no evidence that their conflict with Rasputin was the reason for these punishments. The fact is, all 3 of them were firebrands who'd clashed with both the church and the crown. I mean, heck, Iliodor had even gotten a hold of Alexandra and her daughter's letters to Rasputin and initiated a blackmail attempt. But
I don't know if this is the specific blackmail attempt, but I know in at least one case, and maybe they'll talk about this later, I don't know, there was a blackmail attempt where I think Rasputin had gotten like blackout drunk, and they got all these naked women around him and took pictures. And then took the pictures to the royal family and said, look at what Rasputin's doing. And at least for a while, that got Rasputin kicked out of court, but it didn't last because there was this big incident that happened with Alexei, the Tsarevich, where he nearly died. And at the last minute, they sent a letter to Rasputin, and he sends a telegram and says, hey, he's going to be okay.
Regardless of the facts, the popular narrative was Rasputin was so powerful, he could have his rivals banished or killed. Yeah, that's right. Killed. Months earlier, the Prime Minister, a Rasputin opponent, had been shot. and this too was chalked up in the public eye as another of Rasputin's victims. Then, a barrage of investigations came as the church began investigating Rasputin's beliefs, and the secret police once again began shadowing him in hopes of discovering he was secretly a Kleist. All of this, predictably, caused a furor in the press, who realized that news about Rasputin sold a lot of newspapers. The more salacious and extreme the claims, the better.
Who cares if they're true? If they sell papers and they could be true, we'll do it. And so this just adds, and who does this hurt? Well, it hurts Rasputin, but it hurts the royal family. And again, this is a matter where, whether it's true or not, if people think it could be true and it turns their opinion against you, well, that's bad news for the royal family, who's already in a difficult situation.
Tsar Nicholas, rightly understanding that these scandals were undermining the monarchy, gave orders for government officials to meet with editors and discourage the stories. When that failed, he simply had copies of newspapers confiscated, which is when things got real political.
And I think, and I don't, maybe they already mentioned this in here, but they just stopped referring to Rasputin by name, and they would start using euphemisms for him, but everybody knew who they were talking about. And the same thing was happening with the royal family. When, for example, during World War I, when Nicholas is leading troops at the front and Rasputin is firmly entrenched in the palace at this point, Alexandra would write letters to Nicholas and say, "Our friend at the palace," or "friend at court, our friend says we should do this." And she was talking about Rasputin, but she wouldn't mention him by name.
Because one of the biggest reforms after the 1905 revolution was a guaranteed freedom of speech. And in intervening, Nicholas had just forced a standoff between the Crown and the Duma, the Russian National Assembly, also established in 1905. The Duma began debating whether they would open an official inquiry into Rasputin, the Tsar, and the press intervention.
And here's the thing, the Duma, even though it was set up to supposedly give more power to the people, it really had very little actual power.
And when Nicholas summoned representatives to the palace to talk about it, and then they clashed, it led to a rift between the Duma and the Crown. Basically, Nicholas was used to being an autocrat. His words. It wasn't taking well to the Duma, investigating his private life. And actually, Nicholas didn't even seem to have liked Rasputin much. But on principle, he wasn't going to cave. Turns out, some Duma members were only too happy to pick that fight. See, a lot of Duma representatives had been involved in the revolution and wanted to go even farther. So for them, Rasputin was a convenient prop to criticize the monarchy indirectly. The worst.
We talked about this yesterday. In a culture or in a place where criticizing the monarch or openly revolting or rebelling against the monarch is treason, you go after the monarch's advisors. It's an indirect route to criticize the monarch without being seen to do so directly in such a way that you could be accused of treason. So you go after Rasputin. Rasputin becomes a convenient way to criticize openly Nicholas II.
As Rasputin looked, the more the Romanovs were dragged through the mud. So they went hard at Rasputin, hoping that it would help the cause of revolution. Though, weirdly, monarchists were doing the same thing. They also realized that Rasputin was eroding public support for the Tsar, and thought that if they could smear him badly enough to drive him from court, it would protect the monarchy, which of course backfired. And by 1912, some conservatives were telling each other to stop, lest they bring on a revolution. But there was no putting this demon back in the bottle. In addition to secret police following Rasputin around, there were now reporters tracking his movements. He was the celebrity. It got creepy. Rasputin's eldest daughter received anonymous phone calls from a man trying to bait her into a meeting, claiming to love her. Turns out he was a reporter trying to get close to the family.
Jeez. And let's talk for a minute about Rasputin's family, because this is one of the more interesting parts of this story, is that he did have kids, and they were around long after he was gone. So his daughter Maria ended up dying in 1977 in the United States, where she was living and working as a lion tamer, of all things. I believe that she still has children and grandchildren. In fact, it says here that her granddaughter, Lawrence Holt-Soloveyeva, occasionally visits Russia and lives in the West. And so this is her there. That's Maria Rasputin, sometimes Maria Rasputina. She's buried in California. So yeah, his descendants are still out there. This is Rasputin's great-granddaughter here, Lawrence, the one that we were just referring to. So interesting. His descendants are still out there, like a lot of these famous people we talk about.
And this was all getting to be too much. And Rasputin decided, apparently on his own, to go back to Pokrovska for a while. His enemies celebrated this as a victory. Ha! They'd done it! They'd driven him away from... Oh, no, wait, he's back. Yep, on vacation with the Romanovs. Sneaky, sneaky. Because the fact was, the underlying cause of Rasputin's presence hadn't changed.
Right.
Alexei still, secretly, had hemophilia. Rasputin's presence comforted and calmed Alexandra and her son, which probably in itself helped his healing.
And it's important they note that it was secret. In other words, the general public, by and large, was not supposed to know that Alexei had this devastating disease that couldn't be treated, at least at that time. And so it was kept a secret because it would have been a sign of weakness. But it had a backfire effect where, because people didn't understand what Rasputin's hold over the royal family was, they made up their own ideas about what it was, or they believed what other people said it was. And they didn't understand that this was really about the health of their child and the seeming ability that Rasputin had to heal him, which I think people probably would have understood better than not knowing all the facts.
In the summer of 1912, 8-year-old Alexei had another episode. A jolting
This is the one I
carriage
referred
ride
to.
had started a hematoma in his thigh, which bled for days and caused him incredible agony. Their son's pain and fever were so bad, Nicholas couldn't even bear to be in the same room and fled weeping.
Yeah, this is something that Dan Carlin talked about in an extensive way in his podcast about how the servants at the palace actually were wearing earplugs because Alexei's screams were so horrifying that they couldn't stand to hear it. That's how much pain this kid was in. And you can imagine as a parent what that was like. And the way he described it, the Romanovs, they held it together when they were with Alexei in the room, but then they would leave the room and they would just break down in tears, as any parent would, seeing their child screaming in agony. And Alexei starts asking questions about heaven and whether or not when he dies he will still experience the pain or if the pain will go away. And he talks to his parents about setting up a memorial to him in this forest where he liked to play. And everybody was prepared that this was it, that their child was dying. He wasn't going to recover from this.
Alexandra was distraught. Alexei received last rites, and he asked his mother to reassure him that when he died, it wouldn't hurt anymore. Informed by Alexandra, Rasputin responded.
So put yourself, I know not all of you are parents, and as a parent, I know that I didn't really fully understand this till I became a parent. I'm not saying you can't understand this if you're not a parent, because there's a lot of ways in which you can still relate and have empathy for this situation. But just putting myself in this position, I have a 9-year-old son. He's about Alexei's age. If I saw my child going through this, there's probably almost nothing I wouldn't do to try and help him. The least thing that they would have done would have been to reach out to Rasputin because they know he's helped in the past. They're desperate. They're going to do anything. They're not thinking about public perception. They're not thinking about how's this going to look if we reach out to Rasputin and he comes back. No, they're thinking about their kid and they want him to get better and they want him not to be in this pain anymore.
Responded with a telegram. God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much.
And that's key because, again, whether or not Rasputin knew that the aspirin was helping cause the situation, I think he probably didn't. In hindsight, we know that the doctors giving him aspirin made it worse. But I think it's just more Rasputin being Rasputin.
Alexei recovered 2 days later. Possibly because Rasputin's confidence lessened the stress on him and his mother. Possibly because doctors stopped prescribing aspirin that thinned his blood and constantly probing the hematoma. And possibly because he just recovered. And look, if you're a parent, you understand how crushing it would be to see your kid in such misery. Yep. And you could imagine how you'd fiercely defend anyone who could help in that situation. But the key factor to this is the public didn't understand that.
Yep.
Because it didn't know that Alexei had hemophilia. So to them, Rasputin's continued presence was inexplicable at best, sinister at worst.
Yep.
What did he have on the Romanovs? Had he hypnotized them? Was he controlling them? Were they just weak? Don't they care the entire country hated this man and wanted him gone? He became even more controversial during the First Balkan War, when he lobbied the royal family to keep Russia out of the conflicts and pursue a policy of peace. War, he worried, would simply hurt the peasants and could even pull in the great powers and ruin Russia.
So, and again, now you might ask, well, okay, it's one thing that he helps their kid, but why are they listening to him when it comes to policy and when it comes to the military? Well, again, if you're a deeply religious person, as it seems that Nicholas and his wife were, you see this religious man who's helping, who seems to have some kind of a connection to God, you're probably going to listen to him. You're probably going to trust him in other parts of your life too. So it's not a huge stretch for them to do that. But again, on the outside looking in, it's just more meddling by this crazy Rasputin in a place where he doesn't belong.
Despite his supposed influence, it should be noted that Russia did join the First Balkan War, though not the Second. But his anti-war stance made him even more controversial. Government ministers, even family members, started their own private campaigns to get him expelled. The secret police continued their surveillance, initially giving Rasputin the codename Ruski, or the Russian, but later changing his designation to the Dark One. They chronicled his trips with female followers to bathhouses and visits to sex workers. Agents tailed anyone who had contact with him and read their mail. Though still, after all of this, when they presented Nicholas their report, he discarded it. But there were other plans to get rid of Rasputin. Violent plans. The police foiled at least one, and then it happened. June 1914, Pokrovska, Siberia. Rasputin has just stepped out his front door, hoping to catch a telegram messenger he'd just dispatched. That's when he sees the woman. She's disheveled, strange, wearing a bonnet and veil so only her eyes show, though her veil is oddly flat, as if she lacks a nose, a common symptom for poor sex workers who have been ravaged by syphilis. Thinking she's seeking money, he greets her and takes out his wallet. Then she steps close and plunges an 18-inch dagger into his stomach. He clasps his hands at his belly, running down the street yelling for help. The strange woman pursues, holding the bloody knife high. In a moment of quick thinking, Rasputin notices a big stick, snatches it up, and clubs the woman across the head. An investigation will find that the woman is a 33-year-old peasant and mentally unstable. A devoted follower of Iliodor, after reading his attacks on Rasputin, she'd taken it upon herself to kill the devil and stalked him across several cities.
Honestly, surprised this didn't happen more often. Surprised that Rasputin didn't have people around him to protect him. But then again, he may have felt that God would protect him and that he didn't need to worry about such things. And the fact that he survives this attack and things like it probably only emboldened him more.
Rasputin's surgery was messy, very touch and go. Bad enough that newspapers in the capital, employing the usual exaggeration, actually reported his death. His enemies drank toasts and celebrated.
Oops.
Until a few days later, that is, when it came out that Rasputin had lived. A recovery owed to a good surgeon and strong constitution, but that appeared to the public like a supernatural resurrection. For it would take more than a stab wound to kill Rasputin. It would take a prince.
All right, well, as always, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch this. If you like what you see, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting that like button if you would. And also, episode 10 from my trip to France to the battlefields of the Western Front is live, and this current one has to do with Russia, Russian troops who fought on the Western Front in France. I'll put a link up here on the screen so you can check that out, or check out the entire series of videos. I'm very proud of how they've come out, so if you've never checked out my original content, it's a really great place to start. Thanks for watching.